Get in the back closet, Margaret, right now. Don't make a sound. I stared at my housekeeper, Dorothy, like she'd lost her mind. She was 72 years old, had worked for our family for 19 years, and she was whispering to me in my own hallway like we were hiding from a burglar. Dorothy, what on earth? Please. Her hand gripped my wrist and I felt how hard she was shaking. Please, Margaret, I found something. You need to hear this for yourself. If I just tell you, you won't believe me. I wouldn't have believed me either. I was dressed for my daughter's graduation. My hair was done. I had on the pearl earrings my late husband, Gerald, had given me on our 25th anniversary. I was supposed to leave for Convocation Hall at the University of Toronto in 40 minutes. My daughter, Claire, was about to receive her MBA, and I had been counting down this day for 3 years. And Dorothy was pushing me into the coat closet off the main hallway. "The closet door doesn't close all the way," she said quickly, her voice barely a breath. "You'll be able to hear everything. Don't come out until I come for you, no matter what you hear." Then she shut the door. I stood in the dark between Gerald's old winter coat and a row of umbrellas, and I thought, I am 63 years old, and I am hiding in my own closet. Gerald would have laughed until he cried. But Gerald wasn't here. He'd been gone for years, and Dorothy had never, not once in 19 years, asked me for anything she didn't have a sensible reason for. So I stayed. I heard the front door open. I heard footsteps, 2 sets coming down the hardwood of the front hall. I heard my daughter, Claire's voice, and I felt the tight, familiar pride I always felt when I heard her, followed immediately by something else, something I couldn't name yet. She wasn't alone. "She thinks I've already left," Claire was saying. Dorothy told her the car service was coming early. "We have about an hour. That's enough time." The second voice was a man's, low, careful. I recognized it. It was the voice of my daughter's fiancé. His name was Preston. I want to explain what I mean when I say that, because the name alone doesn't carry what it needs to carry. Preston Caldwell had been in my daughter's life for 14 months. He was 38, 2 years older than Claire. He was handsome in the way that men sometimes are when they've learned to use it, the kind of handsome that opens doors before anyone has decided whether to let them in. He worked in private equity. He had an apartment in the financial district and a ski chalet near Collingwood that he mentioned often enough to make sure you didn't forget it. He spoke the way certain men do when they've decided they're the smartest person in any room and have simply stopped checking. Claire had introduced us at dinner at Canoe on King Street. I'd watched him order the wine without asking her preference, and I had filed it away the way mothers do, in that drawer we keep for things we hope we're wrong about. I had smiled. I had been polite. I had told myself it wasn't my marriage. The engagement had been announced 6 months ago. The wedding was planned for September at a vineyard in Niagara-on-the-Lake. And now he was in my house, in my hallway, and my daughter thought I wasn't home. "The trust document," he said. "Did you find where she keeps it?" Silence. Then Claire said, "Her office, top drawer of the filing cabinet. It's not locked." Something moved through me then, something cold that started at the back of my skull and traveled slowly down my spine. I made myself stand perfectly still. "And the amendment she was talking about?" Preston again. "She mentioned it to her lawyer in March. I don't know if it's been signed yet. It needs to not be signed yet." Another silence, longer this time. I had set up a family trust when Gerald died. It wasn't complicated. It was designed to protect the assets we had built together over 31 years of marriage: a house in Rosedale, investments, a small commercial property in Oakville that Gerald had bought in 2003, and that had appreciated considerably. When I turned 70, or if I passed before that, the trust would distribute to Claire and to our son Thomas, who lived in Vancouver with his husband and their 2 daughters. The amendment I had asked my lawyer, Patricia, to draw up was simple. I was adding a clause that would require any distribution to a married beneficiary to account for the marriage as separate from the inheritance, a standard protection. Patricia had recommended it when Claire got engaged. Preston knew about it. Somehow Preston knew about it. "If it's already signed, there are still options," he was saying. "It would just take longer. I don't want it to take longer." Claire's voice was different from the voice I knew, flatter. "I want this settled before the wedding." "You said." "I know what I said." "You said once we were married, it was straightforward." "You said Canadian law." I said it was more straightforward, not that it was automatic. There's a difference. A pause. If the amendment is already in place, we may need to approach it differently. A legal challenge could take years, and I'm not paying Harrington and Associates for years. I had stopped breathing. I became aware of this when the edges of my vision began to go slightly soft, and I made myself inhale slowly through my nose. Gerald's coat still smelled faintly of him, cedar and something warmer underneath, something I had never been able to name. I pressed my fingers against the sleeve. My daughter was telling this man about my trust. My daughter was helping him find a way around an amendment designed to protect her own inheritance. I did not want to understand what I was hearing. I want to be honest about that. There is a part of your brain that simply refuses, the way a door refuses when someone has turned the bolt. I stood in the dark and felt my mind pushing against what my ears were giving it, trying to find another interpretation, another arrangement of the words that meant something different. There wasn't one. I want to see the document, Preston said. Footsteps moving down the hall toward Gerald's old study, which I used as my office now. Then Dorothy's voice coming from the kitchen, perfectly calm. Mr. Caldwell, can I get you something before you go? I've just made coffee. A beat. Then his footsteps changed direction. She was buying time. Dorothy was 62 years old, and she was running interference in my hallway like she'd been trained for it. I stood in the closet for 23 more minutes. I counted them by the clock I couldn't see, measuring the seconds the way you do when you have nothing else to hold on to. I heard Preston's voice and Dorothy's voice from the kitchen, a conversation I couldn't make out, pleasantries stretched thin. I heard Claire moving in the office, the soft slide of a filing cabinet drawer. When Dorothy finally opened the closet door, she didn't say a word. She just looked at me, and her eyes asked if I was all right, and I shook my head very slightly because I wasn't. And she reached out and straightened my pearl earring, which had turned crooked in the dark. Then she handed me my coat. I need to go back to the beginning because this is not where the story starts. Or it is where it starts for me, standing in the dark in my own home, listening to my daughter, but it isn't where the story starts for Dorothy. She had started seeing it in March. She told me all of it that afternoon, after Preston's car left the driveway. We sat at the coffee table with the coffee she'd made as a decoy still sitting between us, and she told me everything in the methodical, careful way that Dorothy did everything, the way she'd raised 5 children and nursed her mother through Alzheimer's, and survived a car accident at 58 that had left her with a slight tremor in her left hand that she managed by always holding her coffee cup with her right. She had noticed the phone calls first. Preston had been at the house in March for Sunday dinner. Claire had started bringing him regularly by then, and Dorothy had been clearing the table when she heard him in the front sitting room speaking in a low voice. She hadn't meant to listen. She'd simply been walking past. The trust is structured around the Ontario legislation. If we're inside the marriage when the distributions happen, the standard application would include, and then he'd lowered his voice further, and she'd lost the thread. She had filed it away. She wasn't sure what it meant. She told herself maybe she'd misheard. Then in April, she'd taken a phone message for Claire Preston, asking Claire to call him back. Nothing unusual. But when she'd written the message on the notepad on the counter, she'd pressed down harder than usual. And when she tore the sheet off, the impression on the page below was still there. She hadn't read it on purpose. She'd just seen it. It was a name, Harrington and Associates, and a number. She'd looked them up. They were a firm that specialized in estate litigation. In May, she'd heard Claire on the phone in the garden, not the sitting room, where voices carried differently. Dorothy had been upstairs, window open. She'd heard 2 things clearly. She trusts me completely, Preston. And she won't see it coming. Dorothy had sat down on the edge of the guest bed and stayed there for a long time. She told me she had asked herself whether she was being foolish, whether she was reading something sinister into nothing, whether her fondness for me was making her suspicious of a young man who might simply have been having a normal conversation about finances. She had decided she needed more before she came to me. What she'd found in the 3 weeks since was enough. Preston Caldwell had been married before, not briefly, not in his early 22nd. He had been married for 6 years to a woman in Calgary, and the divorce had been finalized 18 months before he met Claire. The divorce had involved a protracted legal dispute over his former wife's inheritance from her mother. Dorothy had found the court records through a public database. Preston had not won, but he had delayed the final settlement long enough that his ex-wife's legal costs had consumed a significant portion of what she'd been entitled to. He had done this before, not identically, but the outline was the same. I sat at my kitchen table and I looked at the pages Dorothy had printed at the public library. She didn't own a printer, she said, and she hadn't wanted to use mine in case I came home and saw them, and I felt something shift inside me that I don't think has ever shifted back. My daughter knew. That was the part I couldn't move past. Claire wasn't being deceived, she was participating. I want to be careful here because she is still my daughter and I am still her mother, and those are not small things. I thought about who she had been at 7 and at 15 and at 22 when Gerald got his diagnosis, and she had driven 4 hours from Ottawa without being asked because she'd heard something in my voice on the phone. I thought about the person I believed her to be, and then I thought about the filing cabinet drawer, and she trusts me completely, and I let myself sit with both of those things at the same time, which is one of the hardest things a mother can do. I did not go to the graduation ceremony. I called Patricia, my lawyer, from my bedroom, and she told me the amendment had not yet been signed. We had a meeting scheduled for the following Tuesday. She listened to what I told her in the silence she was professionally trained to maintain, and then she said, "Margaret, I'm going to need you to come in first thing tomorrow morning." She also gave me the name of a family lawyer she trusted. I called Thomas in Vancouver. That was the hardest call. He asked me 3 times if I was sure, and I said yes all 3 times. And then he was quiet for a long moment, and he said, "What do you need from me?" And I loved him so much in that moment I couldn't speak. Then I asked Dorothy if she would stay for dinner. She said she'd already started soup. The graduation ceremony was over by 4 o'clock. I know because called me at 4:15, cheerful and clear-voiced, telling me about the reception afterward, asking if I was feeling better since Dorothy had told her I'd had a headache and hadn't been able to make it. She mentioned Preston had surprised her with a reservation at ALO for dinner. She said she wished I could have been there. I said I was sorry I'd missed it. I said we would celebrate soon. I said I loved her, which was true even then. She said she loved me too, which I chose to believe. I spent the following week moving carefully. Patricia had advised me not to change my behavior. Do not cancel the wedding venue. Do not mention what I knew. Do not alert Claire that anything had shifted. Patricia and the family lawyer, a woman named Diane Reeves, who wore no jewelry and asked questions like scalpels, had advised me that what I needed was documentation, a paper record of what had happened and what had been said before I made any move. Dorothy had kept everything. Every printout, every note. She had also, it turned out, written herself a private log since May. Dates, times, what she'd heard, what she'd found. She had done this because, as she told me simply, she'd hoped she would never need to show it to me, but she'd wanted to be thorough, just in case. 19 years. She had worked for us for 19 years, and I had not until that week fully understood what that meant. I signed the trust amendment on a Tuesday morning. Patricia had expedited it. I also restructured the trust itself on Diane's recommendation, in a way that made any legal challenge considerably more difficult and considerably less rewarding. It was not, Diane was careful to tell me, designed to disinherit Claire. It was designed to protect what Gerald and I had built from someone who had decided to treat it as a transaction. On Wednesday, I called Claire and asked her to come for lunch on Saturday. I spent Thursday and Friday deciding what kind of mother I wanted to be. I am not a person who performs grief. Gerald used to say that about me, admiringly, though occasionally with a hint of frustration that I process things internally, quietly, and emerged on the other side with a decision already made. He was louder in his emotions, more willing to say the difficult thing in the difficult moment. I used to think I was more rational. Now I think we were just different, and the truth, as it usually is, was somewhere in the complicated middle. I thought about what Claire had said. She trusts me completely. I thought about what that meant, what it revealed about the person my daughter had decided to be inside this relationship. I thought about Preston, and I thought about his ex-wife in Calgary who had probably been someone's daughter too. I decided I was not going to ambush Claire. I was not going to perform righteous anger, not because I didn't feel it. I felt it like something physical, something I had to breathe around, but because I have learned that the moments when you most want to make someone feel the weight of what they've done are usually the moments when it's least useful to try. I wanted my daughter back. I wasn't sure I could have her, but I knew I couldn't reach her through a confrontation that let her put up walls and stand behind Preston and tell herself that I was the problem. Claire arrived at 12:30 on Saturday. She brought flowers, yellow tulips, the ones she knew I liked. She hugged me in the doorway, and she smelled like her shampoo, the same kind she'd used since university, and I held on for a moment longer than usual. Dorothy had made lunch and then excused herself to visit her sister because Dorothy understood things without being told. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had drunk the decoy coffee 5 days earlier, and I let Claire talk about the wedding for 20 minutes. The venue was confirmed, the dress had been altered, Preston's family was flying in from Edmonton. She was thinking about peonies for the centerpieces because roses felt too expected. I listened. I let her be happy or let her perform happiness or let the space exist where I could no longer tell the difference. Then I said, I need to tell you about some changes I've made to your father's trust. She went still. Not dramatically, just the way a person goes still when something they were expecting and trying not to expect finally arrives. I told her clearly and without accusation. The amendment had been signed, the structure had been updated. I told her the name of the firm Preston had been researching, Harrington and Associates, estate litigation, Calgary and Toronto offices. I watched her face while I said it. She didn't deny it. That was the thing I hadn't been prepared for. I had prepared for anger, for tears, for defensive deflection. What I got was something quieter, and in some ways worse. She looked down at her tulips sitting in the vase between us, and she was very still, and she said nothing. I'm not telling you this to end your relationship, I said. I'm telling you because I love you and because I think you've been told something or told yourself something that isn't true about him, about what this is. She looked up then. He said you would never understand, she said. Her voice was careful, measured. He said you'd always found a way to keep the money close, to keep control. I know, I said. That's the story that makes what you did make sense. She flinched. I slid the folder across the table. Inside was a copy of the Calgary court records, the years of Preston's first marriage. His ex-wife's name was Sandra, the documentation of what the litigation had cost her. Claire didn't open it, but she didn't push it away. We sat in silence for a long time after that. The kind of silence that with some people would feel like a wall going up. With Claire, I had always been able to tell the difference. She had a kind of silence that meant she was actually listening. A quality she'd had since she was small. A willingness to sit inside something uncomfortable rather than fill it. I had always considered it one of her best qualities. I let her sit in it. I didn't know about Sandra, she finally said. I know you didn't. He wouldn't have told you. He made it sound like it was about protecting us, about protecting what we'd built together. He has money, Mom. He doesn't need yours. Then why the lawyer? I asked quietly, not as an attack. She didn't answer. I did not pressure her. I told her I had made my calls. I told her the trust was protected, not as a punishment, but as something her father and I had built for her and for Thomas and for their children, and that I intended to keep it that way. I told her I wasn't asking her to leave Preston. That was her decision, and it would remain her decision, and I would not pretend that I could make it for her. I told her I was her mother, and I intended to stay her mother, and that was not contingent on what she decided. She left 2 hours later with the folder under her arm. I stood at the front window and watched her car go down the street, and I thought about Gerald, the way I always do when something happens that I would have needed to tell him. I thought about how he used to say that the hardest thing about loving someone was accepting that you couldn't carry everything for them, couldn't always step in front of what was coming. He had tried with his illness. He had not wanted me to see him diminished, and I had stood my ground and watched him anyway because that was my right as the person who loved him most. I thought about daughters and about trust and about all the ways a person can be two contradictory things at once. Dorothy came back at 4 o'clock with butter tarts from the bakery on Mount Pleasant because that is the kind of woman she is. We sat at the kitchen table again and drank tea and didn't talk much, which was exactly right. 3 weeks later, Claire called to tell me the wedding was postponed. She didn't say it was canceled. She said postponed. I didn't ask for more than she was ready to give. She came for dinner the following Sunday, just the two of us. She brought wine, an Ontario Riesling, a good one, from a vineyard near Niagara, where we'd gone on a trip when she was 17. I don't know if she remembered that, or if it was coincidence. Either way, I chose to take it as something. We didn't talk about Preston. We talked about Thomas's daughters, who were 6 and 9 and had just started skating lessons. We talked about a book we'd both read. We talked about Gerald, the way we were able to sometimes now, without the rawness, just the memory, sitting with us at the table like a welcome guest. At the end of the night, when she was putting on her coat, she turned to me in the hallway, the same hallway, and she said, "I didn't tell him anything after March, Mom. I want you to know that." When I started to see it, I stopped. I looked at her for a moment. "Why didn't you come to me?" I asked. She was quiet for a second. "I think I was ashamed." I pulled her into a hug in the doorway, the same way I had when she'd arrived for lunch 3 weeks earlier. This time, she was the one who held on longer. I don't know what happens after this. I am 63 years old, and I have learned that the phrase, "I don't know what happens after this," is not the frightening thing I used to think it was. Gerald taught me that. The last year of his life taught me most of the things worth knowing. What I know is this. I have a daughter who is, in some complicated and incomplete and still in progress way, finding her way back to herself. I have a lawyer named Diane, who wears no jewelry and asks questions like scalpels. I have a trust that is protected. I have a son in Vancouver who calls every Sunday. And I have a housekeeper who has worked for my family for 19 years, who printed court records at the public library, and kept a private log in a notebook she hoped I would never need to see, who made soup when I couldn't eat and bought butter tarts when words weren't enough. There is a kind of loyalty that doesn't announce itself. It simply shows up, quietly, in the hallway, and tells you to get in the closet and trust it. I did, and it was the most important thing I could have done. If you are listening to this, and you have someone in your life who has shown up for you, that quietly, that steadily, without being asked, I hope you know what you have. I didn't, fully, until I was standing in the dark between a winter coat and a row of umbrellas, counting seconds I couldn't see. I do now.